As they introduced me, my name's Al D. I'm the founder of Betterwork Labs, and I'm a consultant and speaker. And there's probably three things that I really focus on and what really drives me to do the work that I do. The first one is, how do we create organizations where people can do their best work? And the second is really around, how do we help put in people in the right places in their organizations so that they can use their talent and potential? And then the last thing is, what role does technology play in all of that? And those are the three things that I think a lot in the work that I do and have done throughout the course of my career. So as Kevin mentioned, I kind of grew up in the association world in a lot of ways in terms of going to conferences and events through my dad. He would bring me along, and I would see a lot of the work that you all did in terms of trying to advocate for something that was bigger than just all of yourselves and really advancing the cause of your organization and your profession. And so what I want to do today, based off of the work that I have done, both in the for-profit as well as non-for-profit space, is to talk about three things. The first really is, as we're thinking about where we are today in terms of the changing world of work and really the role and opportunity that technology plays in all of that. I think you saw a lot of that through all of these sessions earlier today and some of the solutions that are out there. The second thing I want to talk about are just mindsets that as leaders you can start to think about and adopt so that you can take advantage of all the amazing technology that's out there. And then the third thing is to give you some lessons for leading change. And in this piece, I'm really going to hone in on how can you take what you've done today and all that you've seen and bring it back home and to think about how as leaders you can put this into action and really shift the culture of your organization to thrive in this new world of work. And I also realize I am the thing between us and happy hour, so I'll try to bring the energy and try to make it inspiring for all of you. Okay, so let's start, and I want to start first with going back. Let's go in the way back machine to that foreign time of 2018 and 2019. I remember using this slide in a presentation talking about how fast the world was changing and the role that technology was playing in terms of transforming our lives and our work. So there was a study done by the folks at Capgemini that really looked into how many companies in that Fortune 500 were still around from the year 2000. At that point in time, there was about 52% in that Fortune 500 that had vanished. And the reason why I bring this up is because I know that we've all really seen a lot of change and felt a lot of change in the past 2.5 years. But a lot of those things were just a long time coming. They're things that we had known and seen, right? Now, certainly COVID kind of lit a match to all of that, right? In terms of, it really accelerated all of those changes that we were seeing from a technology perspective, from a culture perspective, in terms of the role that consumers and members and their expectations were changing. For those of you who fly in and out of O'Hare, or maybe go through the United terminal sometimes, you know how they have that walkway that you can kind of speed on? I like to think of COVID as that walkway. For folks who were using technology, it allowed them to speed on ahead, right? If you talk to the folks, particularly early on in COVID, who had been adopting digital tools and technology, a lot of the IT leaders that I talked to, it said was a blessing in disguise because it allowed them to really run with a lot of things that they had in motion and give an excuse to do some things differently that they had wanted to do all along. And certainly those who had not been thinking about those tools and technologies, like many of the ones that we saw earlier, they really struggled to certainly keep up. And so as kind of this McKinsey research shows, COVID really did give an accelerant to a lot of those digital technologies, and they're saying often by really several years. But here's the thing, as great as technology is and as amazing as it is, there are some challenges with it, particularly in terms of how we're using it. So I'm borrowing some research from my friends at Community Brands. They run a research report every year that was featured a little bit earlier, but they've been doing it for about the past 5 to 6 years. And so what's unique about this report is that they actually will research and do studies with both professionals as well as members. And so when they talk to professionals love technology, and they think it really is transforming and changing their association for the better, which is great, about 76% of them. But what they're also saying is that, or at least half of them are saying, is that we're not going fast enough, right? What we have is great, but the market is moving faster, and our members' expectations are moving faster, and we can't keep up. But it gets also a little concerning when you actually talk to members. So one of the great things about this research is that it's longitudinal. So when you go back to 2017, and when they asked members, do you think your association is innovative? About 61% said it was. When they did that study this year, it was about 56. Now, some may argue, well, 5 percentage points, that's not as much. But when you take these into totality, what you're seeing is that we accept and know that technology is transforming and changing our organization and in our association. We know that we need to be using it more and more, but we can't keep up. And our members say the same thing. So if we all agree that technology is playing an increasingly important role, but we can't keep up, where's the gap? What's the rub? In the work that I do in terms of transformation work and organizational development work, and the work that I've done for the past 12 to 15 years, we always have a framework that we use, and I'm sure many of you have heard it before. It's called people, process, technology. And so when I was at Deloitte and working in consulting, our clients would come to us and they'd really want to hone in on the process piece because they knew we were consultants and we knew the best practices and the innovative ideas around strategies and things. So in the PPT framework, it was always about the process. And then I went to Salesforce and I started doing more work in terms of the transformation work we did there. And when I was there, because Salesforce is one of the world's most innovative companies, they were always honing in about the technology. And in both cases, they both thought about the most important thing last. And that was the people, right? We heard it this morning from Tiffany, right? In terms of really seeing humans for who they are and taking them on the journey and talking to them in their ways. And when you think about the challenges to transformation and change and adopting innovative technology, it really does come back to those people and human and cultural elements. And so you'll see some of these up here. I think many of you are familiar with them. By show of hands, how many of you have struggled with one of these before? How about 2? How about 6? Yeah, for sure. And it tells us what we already know, that when it does come time to drive that change and actually work in new ways with technology, those people and those cultural elements are the things that always tend to hold us back. So the question then becomes, if we know that technology is important, if we know that we're struggling to keep up, how do we think and work differently, right? How do we think and work differently, use technology to better lead our members and our volunteers, our organizations and our staff, and really advance and advance the professions that we're in? And so I want to offer a way of thinking about this, particularly because you are all leaders in some way, shape, or form. And I think one of the important things about being a leader is that how you make decisions which impact your staff, your association at large, is often a result of the mindset that you have. And so what I'm going to suggest that in this world of change and uncertainty, we all need a new mindset for how we think about how we deliver value to our members and our professions. And that starts with this. I always love finding quotes. And this is one of my favorite quotes from Albert Einstein for the work that I do. And really, I think, really relevant to the work that we're all trying to do today. And it's, you can't use an old map to explore a new world. You can't use an old map to explore a new world. And I think if I've learned anything from the past 2.5 years in particular, we are in a new world, right? We are in a new world that is different than what we had before. And so if transformation really is about thinking and working differently in new ways, well then, how do we make sure that we have a new map to explore this new world that we're in? So what I want to do now is I want to give you 4 lessons that I think can be helpful to thinking about how do we rewire that mindset, and then how do we take some tactical actions and practices to go and implement them as we think about all the great technology ideas and programs and solutions that we're thinking about implementing. And what I'm also going to try to do is use some of your peers and some of the lessons that I've learned from them through some of the work that I've done and the people that I've been privileged to know. Because while I do think I have some good ideas, I also know that sometimes learning from others, particularly who have gone through this, similar to you, can often be helpful. Okay, so I got 4 lessons, and so I'm going to start with number 1, which is all about bringing people along on the journey. So whenever you're leading change, I think it's really important to understand and remember that the goal of what you're trying to do is scale your impact beyond yourself, right? And so the more that you can think about how you're going to be able to not only bring people along on the journey, but to give them a role along the way, that is your way to be able to scale the impact of the change that you're trying to make. And I think that's important for two reasons. Number one, you can't do it all alone. And number two, the change journey can often be challenging for people, particularly when it's not something that they opt into. So oftentimes, when we think about change or when we're planning, it often looks like this, right? One of those nice, really pretty graphs where it starts with making them aware, and then we make sure that they understand it, and then we get their buy-in, and then we gain their commitment, and then they have that full ownership, right? That's what it looks like when we start, a nice, really pretty graph. But then reality comes in. And it looks more like this, right? Shock, denial, frustration, that trough of disillusionment, going experiment, decision, and then the summit, maybe back a couple times here and there. And so when you can bring people on the journey and give them a role along the way, it makes going through this a lot more worthwhile, a lot more meaningful, a lot more reason for them to be involved and be engaged. And so I want to give an example of someone who I think has done a really good job of really embodying this idea of bringing people along on the journey. And that is Pravash Shrestha, who is the Chief Digital Strategy Officer for the Independent Community Bankers Association. Now, independent community bankers, these are community banks. They touch about 700,000 locations in the United States. And so they play a really big role in terms of how people get served in terms of their financial needs within local communities. If you know Pravash, he has always been a change maker and an innovator. And so when he took over as his role of Chief Digital Strategy Officer in about 2016 or 2017, did an honest assessment of what was going on, he realized that he needed to do two things. The first thing was, how do we make our organization a digitally enabled and operating organization internally? Really thinking about the tech stack and digitizing the operations. And that was important. But the second thing that he did and thought about was, how do we use technology to deliver value to our members in new ways, right? And consistently innovate to meet the changing needs and expectations. Pravash is someone who's just collaborative by nature, and he knew that he could not do this alone. And so he really championed this idea of bringing people along on the journey in a number of different ways that I want to go into. But I think first and foremost, the thing that stuck out to me about Pravash is that he did realize that it was a journey. And so I won't go through all of these because that would take a little bit too long. But the journey for him started in 2017 in terms of moving all of the physical servers to Microsoft Azure. That was a big deal at the time, as it may have been for some of you who have had to go through that journey. But he knew that he needed to start somewhere, and he needed to lay the groundwork and infrastructure for it. And I think one of the things that he did really early on that really stuck out to me that made this much more compelling for others to be involved was really relying on his peers on the leadership team to take part in the change. Pravash has always kind of worked in IT for his entire career, but he's really realized the importance of having good partners along the way. And so anytime, particularly early on, that he got a chance to talk about the transformation program, he always made sure to involve some of his partners at that leadership level along the way, championing them and encouraging them to champion it too, so that they had buy-in into the experience. And so that would come to roost a little bit later on. But I think a big thing along this journey started to really come into effect around 2019. So change can happen in big and small ways, but a couple small things that Pravash did to really change the culture started first with really starting to become mobile first. And two things that he did there that I thought were kind of interesting and compelling, small but made a difference, were the first was he knew that being mobile first was going to be a part of their digital strategy. And so whenever he put in an edict and said to his internal teams, if you develop something that is not mobile first, I'll say thank you and I'm going to send it back. So it took his IT team about 3 or 4 projects until they actually realized he was for serious. And so now, after that, they started developing mobile first. But he extended that even further, and he put in a requirement for the vendors that they worked with that they needed to adhere to that same kind of framework and that same kind of principle. And the point of it is that when you're leading change, you do have to do things alone sometimes, but there are other ways to bring in other people along the way and make cultural shifts that eventually lead to bigger movement. But the other thing that he did in terms of really trying to digitize some of their operations, as I mentioned, was really trying to find ways to deliver value in new ways. When you're the Chief Digital Strategy Officer, sometimes I think it's inherent and incumbent upon you to be the one to have to innovate or have to deliver that innovation. But Pravash realized that he could not do it alone. And so one of the things that he did with the approval of his board was he started an ecosystem accelerator program. And so what this was that it was an actual accelerator program where they would go out and find startups and solution providers that were building solutions for community bankers. They would, if you got accepted, you got invited to a 12-week program where you got programming, you got expert guidance and mentorship, you got access to his members who often gave feedback, who were allowed to try prototypes, and at the end of it, if you completed the program successfully, the ICBA actually invested in your company. And so the point of him doing that was he realized that even though he was in charge of innovation, he could not do it alone. He needed the support of others. And so we opened up this ecosystem, which started first with about 10 companies and now has about 40 or 50. So moving forward, because of the early work that he had laid in terms of really digitizing those operations, 2020 and 2021 were challenging for sure, like it were for many of us. But they were really there at that point, really focused not on fighting fires or being reactive, but more so on being proactive. And because they had the technology infrastructure in place, because of the efforts they had put in early on, it was more about thinking, how can we use technology in new ways to deliver value for our members? And so as a result, there were multiple different programs across advocacy, education, and learning, all used through all of the digital operations that they had. So when I talked to Pravash, one of the things that we talked about when it comes to leading change is that you know when change is happening and that you've made progress when you start to see things and behaviors that used to not exist. And so one of the examples around that was that today, regularly each month, they have bi-weekly meetings between IT and marketing, IT and advocacy, IT and these other groups. That never used to happen 5 years ago. But because he brought them along on the journey with them and gave them a role and gave them a seat, it empowered them to start asking more questions, to wanting to know how they could use technology, how they could partner with IT. And I think that's probably a dream of many IT leaders in many organizations. But the other thing that gets really interesting is that because of the work that he launched with the Accelerator Ecosystem Program, they actually developed a new capability. Traditionally, when they thought about technology decisions, like many of us, it came back to the proverbial question of build or buy. But because of the work they did with the partnerships that they formed through the ecosystem, partnership is now a third capability that they have. And so that's another just example of how he was able to really lead that change within his association. Okay, number 2. This is all about experiment to learn faster. So this is a little bit of a riff off of my colleagues and friends in Silicon Valley who often embrace that mindset of fail fast. I think we've all kind of heard that before. And so my maybe unpopular hot take on this is failing kind of sucks, right? Failing kind of hurts sometimes. Like, it's not always really fun, but it can be incredibly helpful when we choose to learn from it. And so this lesson is all about finding ways to experiment and then to be able to learn and to use those learnings to try again. So I'm putting up here what I'm loosely calling the experimentation and learning cycle. And I'm trying to describe it in ways of which you might see it come to life at a big company versus a startup versus a rocket ship. So think of the experimentation and learning cycle as kind of the time it takes to run an experiment, gain some learnings from it, and then use it to do something else. And so going through that cycle. So when you work at a big company, as you can kind of see, it takes a little bit longer to go through that cycle. But when you work at a startup or a rocket ship, you're literally going through that cycle pretty fast. And that intuitively, I think, can make sense. When you're at a big company, there's more at stake, there's more risks, there's more stage gates, there's legal, there's a lot of other things that's in place. And there certainly are impacts, as you can see, but it just takes a lot longer. But when you're working at a startup or a rocket ship, your ability to run an experiment, to gain some learnings, and then to use those learnings to do something new and again that's built off of what you just did is just so much faster. So what that really means is that it's really about a couple things. One, being able to actually go and experiment, right? Which a number of different people have talked about today. But the other things that are really important from it are, what did you actually learn from it? And then how are you actually using those learnings to scale that out in a fast amount of time? To hit home on this example, I want to talk about Tracy Petrillo. Tracy is the Chief Learning Officer at the California School Board Officers Association. And think of these as professionals who work in schools who are not in non-instruction and teaching roles. Tracy's always kind of been an innovator as long as I've known her, and has really tried to experiment and learn to scale innovative learning solutions throughout the course of her career. And she's done a number of different things over the past couple years, particularly during COVID, that I think have been really interesting around experimentation and then learning from those experiments to try to scale them to deliver value. So one example I want to talk about is something that she did when she was working with a healthcare association from 2020 to 2021. So at the time, this association had a certification program that was in person, that was exam-based, so there was a certification and test at the end of it. It was high stakes, so they needed to study, they needed to pass, and it cost about $350. And so for the 5 years that the high stakes certification ran, I think she said they maybe had about 400 or 500 people who had signed up for it. So it was not, by their standards, performing well, and it was losing money. So when COVID hit, knowing that this was something that was struggling, Tracy realized that this could be a perfect opportunity to experiment with something new, to try something different, and to really push the bounds of what they were offering to their members. So with the blessing of her leadership team and the board, they were able to launch an entirely new learning program. So this one was slightly different. So first and foremost, from a modality perspective, it was all virtual because it needed to be. This meant they did have to make an investment in an LMS, but they were able to deliver it virtually. But the second change came in terms of the learning experience itself. Tracy has always been a big proponent of cohort-based learning and really getting people in groups to learn together. But in addition to that, one of the biggest complaint or challenges that I think a lot of learners had the first time around was that the interdisciplinary exam really caused people to have to absorb a lot of information and pull it in from different topics and different themes. But with the micro assessments that were baked in on a module basis, it allowed people to cover a topic, learn about it, and once they did the assessment, kind of move on to the next one. And when it came to stakes, they decided to move away from high stakes, but they offered CPE credits instead, and they made the sessions mandatory. They still wanted to make the learning experience matter. They just wanted to do that in a different way. And then the last thing was with the cost. Tracy's long been a proponent of the whole concept of value, not price. And so she really pushed hard to be able to deliver this at a higher price point, and definitely received a lot of pushback originally at first. But in the end, I have a couple of the results. And so in the 2 years that this has been in place, there have been about 1,700 or so people who have gone through this. So it basically took them about 2 years to reach a little bit like 3.5 times more than the amount of learners who took the original certification on the left. In addition to that, they used kind of this experimental approach to rolling it out. So the first cohort, I think, had about 47 learners in it. And then the next cohort had about, I want to say, a little bit over 100. And then the third cohort had about 450. But between each cohort, they were learning new things. And each time, taking those learnings and baking them into the next thing. And so their cycle time from that experimentation and being able to experiment to go fast really got better and better and better. And so as you think about the experiments that you're hopefully going to be running, or that you're already running right now, there's 3 questions I have for you just in terms of how to make sure that you're actually going through that cycle and using it effectively. So number 1, what's one experiment you've run in the last 90 days? And what did you actually learn from it? Number 2, when's the last time you failed? And how from that learning did that fuel new opportunities? And then finally, what is one thing your association is doing differently for your members, right? And this is all about really trying to hammer home on that experimentation and learning. Okay, number 3, to do differently, think differently. Again, I'm a sucker for quotes, and I think I'm on an Einstein kick, but I think this really gets to the heart of the message that I'm trying to impart in terms of we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. And if you do subscribe to the belief that we are in a new world, it often means revisiting some of the ways in which we traditionally thought about things and trying new ways to think about them to create new solutions. And so someone who I think has really embraced this, already got a cameo this morning, but his name's Eric O'Connor, and he's the Chief Growth Officer for the AANA. And I think Eric really embraces this mindset of being able to think differently in order to generate different results. So one of the things that I think really makes Eric unique is that he does have a different background. He started his career running a photography business. And then after he did that, he then became a marketer and working in digital product development before coming on board to the AANA to be the Chief Growth Officer. And having a different perspective and a different mindset, I think, has allowed him to bring this idea of thinking differently and embracing it, as well as getting the rest of his organization to think differently to generate different solutions. And so there's a couple things I just want to highlight that I think Eric has done a really good job of that has enabled them to come up with some really creative solutions for delivering value to their members. So the first one is just this idea of embracing connected thinking. So a couple weeks ago, Eric actually sent his marketing team to Brand Week, which if you work in advertising and marketing in the for-profit world, that's kind of like your Super Bowl, or one of the Super Bowls, I should say. And when a lot of his folks were there and people were asking him, oh, what do you do? And they told him they work in the association world, a lot of them were perplexed to see them there. But Eric really believed in this idea of being able to put people into new areas where they can learn that are different or adjacent to what their core business is, then bringing them back and thinking about how can we take some of those learnings and embed them and try tests and experiments that could embrace new solutions that make our organization run better. And so, particularly as a leader, if you can do this to make time for it, it really sets the tone for the organization. But that also fuels the second thing I think he's done really, really well to generate new ideas and solutions. So that is test and grow. So this is all about being able to have a small hypothesis, try it out, and see what works, and then scale it out after that. I think like many of you, his association does have a federated model in that they have state chapters. And so one of the approaches that he's taken is that he uses these, he calls them SWAT teams, but they're multidisciplinary or cross-functional teams to actually go and take an experiment, work together on a solution, and then try it with a couple states, and then if it works, scale it, or to make iterations and learnings to scale it to the rest of the remaining states. And so recently, about last year, they were trying to do something to really generate awareness around some of the PR that they were doing. So we put together a team of IT, marketing, advocacy. They worked in a room for a couple weeks, generated a solution that they tried with about 3 states, and I think now they're up to using it with about 10 or 12. The third is around bringing data to ask the right questions. Now, you heard a little bit about this story earlier this morning from Mark with Association Analytics, but when he started, he really was living in that spreadsheet with 26 tabs, right? And so one of the things that I think he did a really good job of, and encourages people of doing a really good job of, is really making sure that it's about using data to ask the right questions. In the case of Eric, the long-standing myth was really in that we have a problem with young professionals. What are we going to do about it? And then being able to take the data, look at the data to realize that's not the right question that we should be asking. But by having that data, he was then able to ask the question of, how do we increase the value of the membership to students so that we can keep them as they become professionals. And so being able to kind of have that muscle of his team, of being able to use data to ask the right questions, now other teams are coming to them whenever they have data, asking them, what are the questions we should be asking? And so it just kind of builds that culture to think differently. And then finally, and probably the most simple one, perhaps the hardest one, is actually making time to think creatively. So a couple days a quarter, he actually clears his schedule and goes somewhere else to work on strategic planning or ideation or creative thinking. And he actually lets his team know and encourages them to do the same. And there are some quarters where it happens a little bit more and it happens a little bit less. But as a leader, someone who has control at least over the initiatives as well as the strategic guidance of the company, really being able to both do this and model the behavior, but then encourage the organization to do it as well. He's really embracing this different idea of trying to find innovation. And I think one of the things he told me when we talked was this idea that top-down innovation isn't going to cut it anymore. Some of the best ideas live within your people who are closest to your members. And if you're not giving them the time and space to actually do this, it's going to limit their abilities to actually help. Okay, number 4. Align future ambitions with your current behaviors. So we've talked a little bit today about change, right? And managing change, and wanting to be able to get to a better future. And so when everything I've learned, at least about change and leading change and helping people and guiding people through change, is that at the end of the day, if you're trying to make a change, it really does start with those behaviors, right? And in order to actually get to where you want to go, in order to actually drive the change in the organization, yes, it's great to have the mission statement and the values and the culture written down and codified and put up on the walls. But as leaders, the best way to drive those changes, to see the future that you want, to get to that ambition, is to actually model the behaviors that you want to see, reward them when they're shown, and then make sure that others know about them. So I want to give a couple examples of how each of these individuals have really tried to model those future behaviors that they want to see, which has enabled them to really drive change throughout the rest of the organization. So I already talked a little bit about what Eric has done in terms of making time and space for his people to create and think and innovate. But one of the other things that he talked about was this idea of making it okay for people to fail. And so I think it's one of those things sometimes that it's really easy to say, but to actually do this and to actually embrace this is much, much harder. So he told me this really funny story about how he tries to encourage failure and make it okay in his organization. When he first, by the way, this is a mindset he's always had. And so when he very first joined the AANA, he failed on a project or something. And he actually decided to share that, not just with the organization, but with the rest of his association. And he got a lot of pushback right away. It just was not something necessarily that was the culture of the association was really ready for. And it was a very humbling experience for him because he didn't realize that that was going to be a mistake in and of itself. But to this day, they often tell that story to new hires that come into the AANA, kind of say, hey, look, you can fail and mess up and become the chief growth officer here too, right? But he really does try to model that belief and try to share that story as a way of making sure that people are aware of it. Right? There's so many different things I could say about Tiffany in terms of how she really brings this to life. But I think she said it best when she talked about how she's in the business of people and humans. And what she fundamentally believes in is really meeting humans where they are, seeing them for who they are, and then being able to talk to them in ways that resonate with them. And you can see that through all the changes that she's leading at the CMA. One of the things that Tiffany and I talked about, and she alluded to it briefly, but she used to work in politics. And so I think a lot of her inspiration for how she leads change comes from that background. So one of the things that she told me was that when she was working on the governor's campaign for president, when he would come into town, she would do these prep sessions with him where she would go and find the 10 most important words that constituents of that town cared about. And then she would drill those words into the governor so that when he was in his conversations, he was always talking about those words. And she used that same approach and has used that same approach over the past 2 years, really leading her transformation. Every webinar, every qualitative interview that she has, she is always intentionally thinking about the words that she uses to talk to people in language that they understand. But it really does speak to trying to really being intentional about the change that she's trying to create. Tracy has done this too, and I think one of the things that I'm always really impressed with Tracy about is that she's pretty fearless when it comes to trying and experimenting. And one of the things we talked about was that if any of you were at ASE Annual, you may have attended Safi Bakal's presentation. But one of the things that Safi said that really resonated with Tracy with me is that next time someone in a meeting or someone in your association says, that won't work here, your response should be, prove it. Prove it. Run an experiment, bring the data, but being able to actually hold people accountable to really rethink and re-examine some of those long-standing beliefs, really starts with your ability to try and experiment. And then finally, Pravash, in terms of really making sure that he was putting in place those guardrails to enable the change. Whether it was something as small as telling his developers that they had to build a mobile first, to doing stuff bigger in terms of inviting solution providers and startups and the venture capital ecosystem, to partner with him. That really embraced that mindset of really thinking and working with. So I love this quote, if any of you have read James Clear's Atomic Habits, but he says, every action you take is a vote for the type of person you wish to become. And while this was really geared at individual behaviors and individual change, I think it can also be applied to organizations as well. So those are my 4 lessons for you for leading change and driving innovation within your association. I think the work that you all do is vastly important to people that are outside of yourself. And so I think it's a wonderful opportunity to work in this space and to be able to have the potential to change, particularly through the lens of technology. And so I'm hopeful that these lessons are helpful to you as you think about how you're going to lead change when you get back to the office on Monday. But just to close it out, really going back to that quote from Albert Einstein, you can't use an old map to explore a new world. If you do believe that the times are changing and that we do live in a new world, my question that I want to leave you is how are you going to build that new map? What are you going to put on there to really guide you so that you can show up best for your members and association? Thank you.